And good evening, everyone. My name again is Peter Smallage. I'm the New York State Extension Forester, and I direct Cornell's ForestConnect program. And part of that is to host this monthly webinar series. We're in May of 2021. We started this in May of 2007. So 14 years later, we still have great speakers as we do this evening. Dr. Ralph Nyland and Stacy McNulty, both from the SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry, who are going to be talking about gardening the beech. And I will let both Stacy and Ralph introduce themselves so they can give a little bit more background. They're both well aligned with this topic and bring a wealth of knowledge and expertise and experience with it. So I'm going to mute Stacy. I'll turn it over to you, and then Ralph, you can introduce yourself and jump into the presentation. Thanks everyone for being here this evening.
Thank you, Peter, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. We're very excited to talk to you about some of the interesting work that we've been doing here at ESF. I am the Associate Director of Research for a field station in the central part of the Adirondack Park called the Huntington Wildlife Forest in the Adirondack Ecological Center, where I'm an ecologist, and I've been looking at forest ecology and various other related topics for over 20 years. So Dr. Nyland, you can go ahead and introduce yourself.
Okay, sometime today, Peter said there are three types of people. There are the beech lovers, and I guess Stacy would fall into that category. The beech haters, and I'm probably there. And the misguided people, that's probably me too. So thanks for being here. We realized that throughout the hardwood forests of northeastern North America, landowners and resource managers wonder, what do I do with the beech? We know that dense understories of beech root suckers will interfere with the establishment and with the survival of other tree species, but also reduce the diversity and the abundance of other plants. Together, that simplifies the ecological system and diminishes opportunities for long-term commodity production and for realizing other ecosystem services. It recommends for beech removal, or at least beech reduction. And at the same time, many wildlife species use beechnuts as an important food source, and beechnut abundance influences their population dynamics, and that recommends for beech retention and even beech enhancement. So what do? We suggest something between these seemingly opposing and conflicting opinions or options, and we call it gardening the beech. Let's start with thinking about forestry and silviculture. Both of them address a landowner's objectives, and we do it by changing stand conditions to ensure a desired future outcome, to be sure that the forest becomes what people want it to be, as long as it's done in an ecologically sound manner and we can sustain the benefits through time. We're always answering a question, what if something else, such as how to balance the ecologic and the economic. And by economic, I mean institutional, social, and financial concerns. It's similar with wildlife habitat management. Managers try to address the immediate needs by making changes in the conditions of the forest, try to balance the opportunities between providing habitat for one species or another or different groups of them, of considering what the long-term effect will be of a treatment that they make, and then figuring out how to sustain those benefits through time. And wildlife management involves manipulating conditions within the ecosystem to maintain habitat, to alter habitat, and to do it for a target species or a desired group of them. And they use silviculture as a way to make the changes in the composition, the density, the size, the height of plants, in other words, the structural characteristics, the spatial regularity or diversity within a stand and across stands, more regular, less regular, the numbers and arrangements of snags and cavity trees, the character and abundance of dead materials like fallen trees and branches and forest litter organic material. And most of this is readily done through silviculture. Just determine what's wanted. What do we need to have to satisfy the habitat needs? And then identify the methods to get there. So both silviculture and habitat management give attention to the landowner's interest. What does the landowner want? We have to start by saying what's there and how does it satisfy the need? What are the options that seem suitable for changing conditions to better serve the interests of an owner? And what obstacles do we face for succeeding in our endeavors? And most important, how to sustain them through time. Often asking, what if? What if some objectives seem incompatible and yet both are demanded? Then how do we strike a balance? How do we integrate the opportunities to come up with some sort of a solution that will in fact satisfy the landowner's interests? Well, how in the world does beech illustrate this? Earlier, I mentioned that it interferes with the regeneration of desirable trees and herb species. That simplifies the ecosystem. That blocks the replacement of non-beech species. That reduces long-term access to commodities and some ecosystem services. At the same time, beech provides a food source for a variety of woodland creatures. So what then? How do we deal with these two conflicting ideas? Let's start by thinking how beech regenerates and what that implies and how it changes the ecosystem. We all recognize two sources. One is seedlings, and those represent a crossing between clones, which could lead to some sort of genetic change. Or from root suckers, that's a cloning, resulting in no genetic change within the root sucker and the parent source. So what about flowering and beechnut production? Since that's the beechnut production is really the concern of many, or at least a major concern for wildlife habitat. American beech has both male and female flowers on the same tree, and it is cross-pollinated by wind. Now, the genetic variation occurs when you have a crossing between different clones, clones of different genetic constitution. And when that happens, it might yield seedlings with the genes for resistance or tolerance. And if that happens, it might enhance long-term survival and continued beechnut production within the forest. At the same time, selfing, that is pollination within the same clone, leads to a high degree of self-sterility. That may vary between clones, one to another, but the low occurrence of sound seed when selfing occurs, or getting seedless fruits, empty shells. So cross-pollination is essential for nut production, and beech pollen, well, we just don't know how far American beech pollen disperses in the wind. But in European beech, it can be about 135 feet. In Japanese beech, up to 260 feet. So something between this range is probably the range for pollen distribution by American beech. That's something to remember. All right, given this cross-pollination, then we get good mass crops at about 2-year intervals. The diagram here comes from Huntington Wildlife Forest, and the vertical axis is the numbers of viable beechnuts collected within the seed traps. The horizontal axis, the range of years from 1988 on the left to 2020 on the right. And the diagram shows that distinct cyclical production of mass, of abundant mass, about every 2 years with a lot of mass 1 year, hardly any or none the next year. And when we get that viable nuts that result from cross-pollination, it's often followed by good germination rates. So we get beech seedlings at least started within the forest.
Ralph, I think
Peter,
we lost you. Go ahead.
am I okay?
Yes, you're back. You were, for a minute there, you were out. So
Okay, it must have been that pig that flew by my window. All right, so on the diagram on the left, shows the percentage of small beech, less than 2 feet tall, that are either seedlings or suckers. The dashed line of the seedlings, the solid lines, the suckers. And where the suckers are sparse, we often can see fairly good beechnut product or beech seedling germination. There are a few tall seedlings, though, where there are tall suckers that are in abundance. And this diagram hints at that by showing that as the solid line, the suckers decrease from one site to another, the beech seedlings tend to increase, at least those in the 2 to 4 foot range. We have some data that sort of reinforce this. Now, this comes from Stan's plots where we removed the beech understory or did not. On the left, you see the data for where we removed the beech understory, and on the right, where the beech understory remained in place, somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 beech stems per acre. We did the removal in 2000, and you see the years we collected seed. In 2001, we had a huge influx of small seedlings, less than a foot, particularly where the understory was removed. That large number of seedlings persisted through 2008. And then for some reason, we got a big drop off compared to the place with the uncut understory. But look at the 1 foot to 1 inch class, boxed in pink. Starts out with far fewer in the place with the understory removed, but then these 1 to 1 inch seedlings begin to increase. And so by 8 years, they're far in excess of what's in the uncut area. And even in 2017, 17 years later, we still have more of these developing beech seedlings where we moved the beech understory. So these indicate or suggest anyway that where beech seedlings are abundant, there will be very few or limited beech root suckers, or to say it the other way around, seedlings will be sparse or develop poorly beneath a beech understory. Something to remember. Now, what about root suckers? American beech, as we all know, regenerates readily by root suckers. It's a cloning. And it comes from adventitious buds that develop on shallow roots, primarily after some sort of a wounding, some sort of disturbance of the bark on the root. It happens in undisturbed and unmanaged sites, perhaps because a deer or a moose walked across the ground and scraped the root, perhaps because freezing and thawing pushed a rock up. But there is evidence that even in the old growth forest where there's no management, and you get beech root suckers, we've seen them proliferate after injuries from logging and other activities, so that that kind of disturbance sets a stage for root sucker proliferation as an aftermath of the disturbance. And that results in a cloning, where the root suckers carry the same genetic and physiological traits as the source tree. Now, to compound this problem, beginning in 1890, the scale insect entered through Nova Scotia, and Beech Bark Disease worked its way down across the Maritimes and into northeastern North America. Now it's out into the Lake States and down into Pennsylvania. And it has decimated the northern hardwood forest in many areas. An important effect of this is that as beech bark progressed, the numbers of root suckers seemed to develop increased around weakened susceptible trees, mostly within about 25 to 30 feet from the source tree, and probably not much more than about 35 feet. And when these get going then and proliferate, we get a dense understory at many sites. That dense understory casts a heavy shade, so we get low light levels near the ground. And we see an increase in the beech leaf litter developing beneath these understories. Commonly, these combination of things interfere with the establishment and survival of other species, leading to low plant species diversity. That includes trees, shrubs, herbs, and even beech seedlings, as I suggested earlier. Yet without the beech understory, we get a brighter environment in the understory, we get higher plant species diversity. One study suggested as much as 1/3 more species where you have the weak or missing beech understory. Here's some data gathered at Huntington Wildlife Forest. The two columns to the right, limited means there are relatively few beech understory suckers. Dense on the right means there's a lot of them. You see, with limited about 500, with dense 2,500. Now note the plant species higher with the limited beech understory, fern species higher with the limited beech understory, shrub species, the same thing. So the presence of a dense beech understory does simplify the diversity and the abundance of plants. And that makes the ecosystem more simple. And that makes, to me, American beech a native invasive species. With beech dominance increasing through time as the root suckers develop. And remember that only 1 or 2% of these beech clones have resistance to Beech Bark Disease, including their root suckers. So as root suckers form off of susceptible trees, many of these trees eventually also get infected, and that compounds the problem. They will eventually succumb to Beech Bark Disease, and through time, the whole problem becomes much worse, which beech becoming much more dominant within the forest and other species declining. All of that encourages beech removal, both of the understory beech and of the larger beech trees, with the large ones coming out to prevent future problems from recurring. All right, that sounds good, but yet if we take all the beech out, it stops beechnut production. And it has some real wildlife consequences. But so what? So what? Why does it matter? At least 40 vertebrates use beechnut as food. And within the mammal populations, at least, we see population cycles matched to beech masting cycles. Here's an important contributor to that, perhaps. This shows the nutritional values of beechnuts compared to acorns, herbs, and corn. Notice the first line, protein, high as corn, not as high as herbs. Fat, it's higher than any of those other sources of food. Carbohydrates, it's low compared to the others. And fiber, it matches up with herbs. So it becomes an important food source to sustain these creatures. And I want to break them into two kind of categories. One I'll call beechnut consumers that eat the beechnuts. They also take in other seeds, buds, vegetation, fungi, and some eat invertebrates. So grouse, jays, chipmunks, foxes, deer, American marten, fishers, bear. These all consume beechnuts, and some of the smaller ones in this list actually become prey to other species like marten and fisher. Now, the data show that with an increase in beechnuts, we get an increase in small mammal populations the following summer and autumn. The data look like this. The vertical axis is the number of viable seeds collected and also the mouse trap, common axis. The horizontal is the year from 1988 through 2020. And again, the black line you've seen before, that's the beechnuts. The purple line, the mice. And you see that the harmony between these two, that as beechnuts are abundant, we then see the next summer an increase in these small mammals. In this case, it's mice. What about bigger creatures like black bears? Interesting fact here that the amount of winter fat that a sow stores up going into hibernation will influence the number of cubs that are born the next spring or come out of hibernation the next spring. 80% of the sows produced young after a good beechnut masting year. And autumn beech mast was the best predictor of the birth rates that would occur during the winter after a masting or a non-masting year. So what about bear population dynamics? Again, beechnut abundance on the vertical axis. In this case, the measure of harvested bears is on the right axis. Now, the count here is for 1.75-year-old bear. And in the graph, he took that and dated it back to the year they were born. So what you're seeing here is a map of when they were born. And you see that as the beechnuts go up, we get more bears. As the beechnuts go up, we get more bears. So the bear cycles mimic the beechnut cycle, with winter births increasing after a heavy masting event. What about the beechnut eating predators, like American marten, fisher, foxes, bobcats, to name a few? They eat beechnut consuming animals, but also eat beechnuts. So let's use the American marten as an illustrative animal here. They prey on small mammals, mice, voles, shrews, so forth, but they also eat beechnuts. And here again is the same kind of curve, beechnut abundance on the left axis, vertical. The total marten harvested in trapping by trappers is on the right axis. Again, the dashed black line is the beechnuts, and the purple line are the marten. And you see there's a repetition of that pattern, but delayed by a year. So good beechnuts this year, good marten trapping the following year. It suggests that masting and cyclical fluctuations of the prey populations may co-influence the population dynamics of American marten, and perhaps some other predators as well, with both the predator and the prey linked to masting. So that all encourages us to keep beech as a food source, to enhance the habitat for prey species and for the predators. So we have two objectives that seem to conflict each other: removing the beech to diversify ecological conditions and enhance commodity objectives and other economic values, or retaining the beech as a food source for some wildlife. So these seem incompatible, but consider a possible compromise. And we call it gardening the beech. Finding and keeping selected trees and clones, promoting their vigor and seed production, releasing seedlings from those trees, maybe some suckers underneath them too, and moving beech elsewhere. So now we need to ask, what trees or clones should we retain and manage? We'd like you to consider these conditions. Pole-sized beech initially were not heavily infested with scale or showed signs of beech bark disease. They had clean bark, as if they had not been affected, but it was a matter of timing. As they got bigger, most of these trees did become infected. So we want to look at the larger trees here. And pathologists in general have 4 categories of health, I guess you call it. One group are trees that are immune, or that organisms that are immune and not susceptible to a harmful microorganism, a particular one. There's the resistant trees. These are unaffected by a noxious agent. Now, Dave Houston has pointed out that it's only about 1% to 2% or less of clones. There are tolerant trees. These endure and produce an acceptable yield of whatever you're interested in. In our case, we're looking at beech masting. And susceptible trees, they develop the disease and die. And from what I've seen, that's the most common condition among American beech. So how do you tell? Well, there are no specific proven field expedient tests that we could find. Potentially, you best judge this by comparing one clone to another in the known presence of Beech Bark Disease. And it's really best determined in stands or forests with a long history of infections in the aftermath forest. So by what characteristics? Well, here Stacy and I turn to the real source, to David Houston. He's been following beech for decades, studying its characteristics of the Beech Bark Disease. He's had longstanding plots where he's measured beech. He's watched the development of the disease and the cankers. And he graciously shared some information that we'd like to in turn share with you. Hopefully we get it right. Dave points out different kind of indicators to look for. One are these things called tarry spots. They're black or brown secretions. They're on the outside of the bark and they indicate that there's dead tissue beneath that waxy or that brown secretion. There are sunken cankers. The tissue beneath is dead and the canker is not walled off. So if you look in the diagram at the lower one, you can see at the end of the arrow some cankers that are sunken. The tissue underneath those is all dead. In the upper diagram is a later stage of that. The tissue is all dead. And these things kill the cambium so that it interrupts the flow of materials up through the cambium tissues. Dave also identifies a thing called walled off cankers. The callus seals off the fungus and the tissue below it remains alive, or there's only a small dead spot there. So the bark underneath these things, most of them anyway, continue to function. And as a result of that, the tree will stay alive for a period of time. Now, trees may have both sunken cankers and walled off cankers. And the sunken cankers tend to accumulate through time, eventually becoming numerous enough to girdle a tree, particularly as they appear in the upper portions of the main bole. And the fourth thing we want to look at is dead bark. You can see the sunken cankers in these. The tissue beneath those is dead. There's sufficient numbers of them to girdle a tree. The bark loosens and sloughs. Oh, so what do we look for in trees of different characteristics within the aftermath forest? Well, let's think about resistant trees. The crowns on these are mostly green. The leaves are full. The bark lacks bark cankers, or if anything that looks like a canker is probably healed over. So the tree just generally looks healthy. Dave considers these immune. Remember now, some of these trees may just have escaped infection, so you have to be careful. The tolerant trees, you find a thinning crown, somewhat off-color leaves. Bark cankers on the lower boles are mostly walled off. You get this healthy bark between the cankers. The tree survives for many years, but eventually succumbs to girdling by additional infections on the upper stems and the branches and the sunken cankers that form there. Now note that there's a different degree of tolerance. So from one clone to another, so some tolerant trees tend to live longer than others. Yet all tolerant trees eventually will die from additional infections. It's just a matter of time. The susceptible trees, the crown is thin, few small yellow leaves, small branches are dying, falling off. The cankers are sunken mostly. They accumulate through time, girdling the stem. Root suckers tend to form around these trees as it weaken and die. When the tree dies, the bark loosens. So when they're dead, they lack leaves. The branches are falling off, including fairly big ones. The bark cankers you will find is numerous. The bark is loose and sloughing. The root suckers may be common around these, and these become snags. Keep that in mind. Those have a value for wildlife. All except the susceptible trees often occur as isolated trees or clones, or as limited number of clusters at widespread locations. A few trees here, a few trees there. So what do we do? How are we going to deal with at least resistant and tolerant clones? We searched the literature for suggestions and found some, but didn't really find it comprehensive. So Stacy and I put together our experience from research and management, and to see if we could suggest some additional options that landowners might use to deal with beech. So let's start with the resistant trees or clones. Our best suggestion is to search them out, find them on your forest, anything that shows resistance or you think might be resistant, and map their locations for future reference. You want to safeguard them, protect them. Don't let anything harm them. Keep them going for as long as you can. It probably is prudent to remove the non-resistant trees that are more than 40 feet away from the clone. Remember that root suckers are going to develop with 30 to 35 feet. So you want to probably keep beyond that before you remove beech trees, adjacent beech trees. When you remove those trees, do it mechanically to avoid any chance of flashback. What did I do? But you want to be sure that you've made provisions for cross-pollination. So you want to keep trees of other clones nearby within wind pollinating distance, probably 150 to 200 feet upwind from resistant trees. We also think it's prudent to mechanically thin the root suckers beneath and within 40 feet of a resistant tree or clone. By thinning those, you reduce the crowding. That should promote the vigor of these small trees of root sucker origin. If something happens to the big trees, we now are maintaining a source for future big trees and future beechnut production by resistant trees. Beyond the root sucker spreading distance, more than 35 feet, remove the suckers. If you reduce the crowding of these suckers beneath, promote beech seedling survival and development, because they're not very abundant where beech understory root suckers are dense. So thinning the root suckers between these, beneath these resistant clones may aid seedling establishment and development. And these seedlings might have resistance or tolerance, and you might be able to use them as planting stock for reducing possible resistance or tolerance into other stands. But plant them during the dormant season, dig them then too, put them out at wide spacing, put them in stands lacking a beech understory, and preferably beneath canopy gaps. Then you want to protect all of that planted stuff and the advanced regeneration, anything within 100 feet of resistant clones and trees, in order to maintain that resistant progeny or potentially resistant progeny for long-term development. That's the resistant trees. Now, what about the tolerant ones? Again, we ought to reserve clusters of nut-producing canopy trees at dispersed locations. These will be clusters of a clone which may have 2 or more stems in them, adjacent to each other. Remember that these clusters develop from root suckering off of a common source. So they will have the same resistance or tolerance as a source tree. And in this case, the tolerance should be the same in all of the trees that are interconnected with that same root system. Now, how do you know which ones will produce beech nuts? Well, look at the bears. As they climb trees, they leave their mark behind. But also, if you look around on the ground, you may see beech seedlings, and those are 2 signs to watch for. We would suggest thinning lightly within the clusters of canopy trees in order to maintain or enhance canopy tree vigor. And do it mechanically to avoid potential flashback from chemicals. We also think it's prudent to thin the sapling size suckers beneath the clusters and within 50 feet of the cluster to maintain the clone. In other words, keep those and take ones that are farther away. Do it mechanically again to avoid flashback. And again, what we're trying to do is to maintain a component of potentially tolerant root suckers that will be there when the bigger trees succumb to beech bark disease. We also need to think about keeping a pollen source nearby within 150 to 200 feet upwind. That'll take some looking and some thinking and some choosing. Now we want to keep those tolerant canopy trees until they decline from beech bark disease. Watching the crown, you'll see the crown thin. You see more and more cankers appearing on the upper stem. And as these decline, you will see a reduction in beechnut production. It can be as much as 1/3 or more as the beech bark disease progresses until a tree is finally dead. You want to retain those dead trees as an important habitat component. They provide cavities for nesting protection for a variety of species. They serve as runways and refugia for invertebrates, salamanders, small mammals, so you can get underneath them and be protected. They provide a decomposing strata, substrate for things like insects and fungi, bryophytes. But watch out for the susceptible clones. Watch out for the susceptible clones. Initially, the beech bark did not seem to affect trees less than about 8 inches in diameter, despite them growing from and within susceptible clones. But it killed the larger trees from the overstory and gave rise to another generation of susceptible suckers and continued interference that results from that dense beech understory. So we suggest removing the clone, perhaps in a two-step operation. First, remove the beech understory. That should promote non-beech regeneration. It should increase the herb cover and diversity as well as the non-beech tree seedlings if you have a seed source. Then when some understory has begun to develop, it may take 3 or 4 years, then go back and cut trees from the mid or upper canopy. That reduces crowding around the non-beech trees in the stand. It brightens conditions in the understory for the shorter trees. It'll help sustain the herb and tree seedling diversity and abundance. Or you might consider girdling some of those trees as well, so that you're developing snags. Hopefully, you can maintain some beechnut production for the short term, perhaps by selecting some 6 to 10 inch beech within the clone. Look for things with relatively clean bolls, full crown green leaves, perhaps at 35 to 40 foot spacing, and thin around them to promote their vigor. But they will eventually succumb. In the short term, though, they may help maintain beechnut production. Remember, as they die, you need to watch for beech root suckers forming around these susceptible trees and perpetuating the same kind of condition. Now, there's an alternative to that two-step process. You could cut all the beech at one time, both the big and the small, even girdling some for snag production. And then in either the two-step or the one-step process, consider transplanting seedlings from beneath resistant trees at wide spacing, beneath canopy openings, and watch for the interference from root suckers that may develop from damaged surface roots that we damaged during logging or other operations within the stand. So gardening the beech, balancing two objectives, ask what fits the landowner's interest. Remove the beech, maintain the beech, keep all the beech, keep some of the beech. What is it the landowner really wants? Or perhaps some combination of these within a stand and different stands across the forest. But when some beech gardening seems appropriate, we suggest starting in one stand and then progressively expanding the treatments to a larger spatial scale until eventually you've created across the forest a mix of stand conditions consistent with the degree of susceptibility and consistent with the landowner objectives. That should increase the complexity of the ecosystem, maintain the habitat for beechnut dependent species, and sustain the productive capacity of the forest for other goods and services. Want more information about this? You see on the screen 2 YouTube sources that you can turn to. The one on the top deals with removing beech, the methods for controlling and removing beech, particularly in the understory, but also in the overstory. The one on the bottom is by Stacy, and it covers the wildlife aspects of things we've summarized here today. You could tune into these and watch the full aspects of them. We also have included at the end of this presentation a series of listings of publications that we cited and drawn upon as we prepared for today. And you might pause the production when you turn on the YouTube version of this and copy or print the screen from it. That will give you a source that you can read and study more. For better or worse, consider gardening beech. Peter?
Another great webinar, Ralph. Thank you. And we have a couple of questions. Stacy, Stacy read them earlier. Do you want to read them again, Stacy, or what's your preference on how to?
Sure, I can do that. Thank you. There were a couple of questions in the chat, and I would encourage folks to put other questions or comments in there and we can discuss them. So The one that came in most recently from Dale Gates, it says, please explain flashback from herbicide treatment. So Ralph, I'm going to let you take that one.
Yeah, in stem injection particularly, if you put chemical into the tree, it may move into the root system, and then if roots of trees, in this case beech, through the interlocking root system of a clone, can be drawn up into other trees as the trees transpire. This is particularly of concern with herbicides like glyphosate that will move into the root system. It's less a case with some other herbicides that don't move that way, but you need to be very cautious in applying herbicides that so you don't take any risk of damaging or destroying or weakening the trees of a clone that you'd like to keep.
Right. And I would add too that it's worth noting, if you're not familiar with it, that a lot of species, including American beech, have mycorrhizal connections between their roots and the fungi in the soil layers and to other trees. So there are a lot of really complicated relationships. The trees are sharing information that way. They are actually sharing sometimes or competing with each other depending on the relationship. And so those fungi and that relationship that's in the soil is actually going to potentially, we think, that may have a lot to do with why some beech trees seem to do a lot better on certain sites than others. Perhaps there's the right combination of other organisms that are there available so that when beech bark disease might come into a stand, or other pathogens for that matter, some trees are going to be able to deal with that better because they have access to more resources. So those root systems that we don't really see because we're working mostly above ground, looking at the top of the tree, if you will, really the action is a lot of times underground. So there is a comment about herbicides, about glyphosate and imazapyr versus triclopyr. So different kinds of herbicides, somebody's commenting on whether they're more mobile in these root systems, as Ralph is mentioning. So there's just a comment there without a question.
Let me add one thing. We did a trial one time where we used one of those other herbicides as a stump treatment. And there was some rain apparently after we put it on, and the stuff must have been washed into the soil and got moved through these mycorrhizae or roots or whatever. So trees that were 25 or 30 feet away of a different species died. So just be very cautious, even though they don't move into the root system. There are other ways for that herbicide to get into the soil and potentially be taken up by adjacent trees.
Imazapyr, I posted about the glyphosate and imazapyr. The imazapyr is mobile in the soil as well as mobile within the tree. So when you do a stem injection or a cut surface, both glyphosate and imazapyr can move to connected trees. Triclopyr particularly is a basal bark treatment. I've never known that to move, and I've never known glyphosate to move as a foliar treatment. So only when it's connected to wood.
Okay, so I know there are at least 2 more questions in the chat, so definitely keep them coming. We love your questions because they give us opportunities to share some other resources that we might have available that would be interesting. So one of the questions from Frida Black says, is there a foolproof way to determine which young trees are seedlings and which are suckers? Foolproof, I guess what I would say to that is that you have to dig a little bit, at least with your hand, along root systems to determine whether a small stem of a beech tree is actually attached to a larger root system or if it's on its own. So certainly, yes, there is a way to do that. It is a little labor intensive. It's not something you can just do by looking. Although you might be able to see evidence of land management, if somebody's been in the stand and either damaged roots, and you can see like the picture that's on the screen right now, you can see a little set of root suckers. You can tell those pretty easily. So Ralph, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, look at the picture on the right. Actually, you see if you look at the main stem and the root system, it forms a T. So if you just reach down with your fingers, you'll be able to feel the roots going left and right. If it's a seedling, you won't feel that. You'll feel a root system going downward. So it's on small ones, it's very easy to separate them out just with your fingers. But Stacy is right. Once they get to be a size, it's difficult to tell. You have to work harder.
But not impossible. So, if you're looking to identify them, if you have a woodlot or land that you're managing, for example, if you did identify some that were seedlings, you could always put a little tag on it and just follow it if you're able to watch it through time and see how they do, because it is pretty interesting. There are some folks at the U.S. Forest Service who are doing research on genetics of beech tree, and we're trying to figure out in the field, are there ways for us to tell in advance which trees might be ones that, all other things being equal, or maybe the ones that you would want to save for various values or ecosystem services, as Ralph said.
Yeah, make one other comment. If you, once you've felt down and checked on quite a few of these root suckers and looked at others and found seedlings, you begin to recognize that there's a distinctly different above ground structural characteristic to seedlings compared to root suckers. So you eventually will get to a point where you just pick them out, or at least many of them, by simply looking.
Right. So, and I'll just follow up. So there was a follow up to that about pole-sized trees. So so as Ralph said, it's much harder to tell once trees get a little bigger, they get a more developed root system, they start to potentially intertwine with their neighbors. It's a lot harder to tell as they get to be, of size. So that's hard. Not impossible, but it's going to take potentially some labor to do that. Earlier, Catherine Stewart asked a question about discussing climate change and impacts, and that dynamic is really complicated, as you, I'm sure, know. And I think that's a great one for discussion time. So I would encourage folks to jump into the chat section for their comments. On the whole, beech trees are probably going to do okay, if not better, with climate change in the region where they're currently native, because we're seeing increased precipitation, winter warming. They're such an excellent competitor already. The fact that they stump sprout and root sprout so easily, the fact that they are very shade tolerant, the fact that these trees can clone but also have the sexual reproduction of the seeds. There's a lot going for this species, actually, that's probably going to make it fairly competitive in the absence of other problems like fungi or other pathogens. So the legacy of an existing forest that has a lot of beech, they're probably going to be there for a long time, most likely. That said, if oaks and hickories and some of the more southern trees continue to move northward or are enabled by that for climate change reasons, or if there's land use changes that kind of come along coincident with that, there's a lot of research that people are doing, looking at modeling in different scenarios with climate in terms of decades into the future. I put a link in the chat earlier about this, and I would encourage Ralph or Peter, if you have anything to add on that. But the answer is we don't really know who's going to be a quote unquote winner in the future, but beech probably has a lot going for it that will make it stick around for a while, we would think. Okay, Jay Hall asks a question. Have you found that truly resistant beech, which he's quoting smooth beech, are susceptible to sun scald if they are released too heavily? So in other words, if we're taking out the trees around it, do they get sun scald?
I have no evidence. I have no idea. I have no idea. We're taking trees around them. You're not going to clear cut the forest. You're going to leave the non-beech trees. And if that's a concern, leave a few around there. Remember, we want to keep a pollen source not far away. So keep some good looking beech trees adjacent to them to shade the stems of the resistant trees. And also any understory will help to provide some protection.
Okay, other questions or comments?
I have a question for Ralph. So Ralph, when you did you described thinning amongst in the gardening phase, you described thinning amongst the younger, smaller plants adjacent to immune and resistant trees. Did you find, did that trigger root suckering within that area, or was the root system sufficiently interconnected that any of that redistribution of growth hormones was directed to the larger residual trees.
Well, remember, we presented an idea here, and not all of this has undergone testing. So I have no definitive information to respond to that. I just don't know. If you run machinery around and disturb the root system, you will get root suckering. If you don't disturb the root system, you minimize the chance of that occurring.
Okay.
I think there's a difference between cutting a tree off and having it die slowly. But I don't know.
Okay, here's another question. So when we were talking about down trees that provide habitat, implies that leaving the diseased logs in place does not increase infective material to harm other trees. Is that true? So generally speaking, if we're talking about beech bark disease specifically, it's in the system. So leaving a snag or a downed log is certainly not going to increase what's already there, because the scale insect is probably already present in the forest, as is the fungus that causes that complex. So it's probably not going to increase anything. I think what we're talking about is if you're going to have a forest, particularly this aftermath phase where you have a lot of downed material from, the dead beech trees, rather than trying to clean up the forest, if you're able to leave components of that provides habitat for a lot of other species, and allows some nutrients to return to the soil to help with the future forest. So the value there is really more the general topic about the value of what we call downed woody materials, rather than worrying about the disease being like a reservoir, if that's what you're getting at. Good question. A couple of more questions. So here's one from Craig Troger. Please address the new beech leaf disease, which is now spreading in a couple of places, and actually it's in Western New York as well, although it's not here where we are in the Adirondacks at least. Beech leaf disease seems to be hitting the smaller trees. So we don't know yet what the interaction is going to be in terms of the forest, but it certainly does seem to be killing young beech pretty readily. So I'm not a pathologist, but we are clearly watching this, because that could again be a game changer, and interacting with some of these other factors with land use, climate change, and other things, it's certainly going to be of concern from a species standpoint. So will it wipe the tree out? Don't know. But again, beech has a lot of capacity to remain and be retained in a forest because of its life history. So it's hard to say. I would ask if people have experience with beech leaf disease, because I have not seen it here, thankfully, yet. Whether you have any comments about it, go ahead. So we have a few more minutes here. If nobody has any other comments about the beech leaf disease, Michael McDonald asks, is fire a treatment for removing the ground suckers and leaving the larger trees?
No. I had an experience, a bad one. We tried to use prescribed burning, spring prescribed burning, to control beech understories and reduce understory competition to try to promote oak seedling development. And these stands had beech root suckers. We ran the fire through, and everywhere we once had a single beech root sucker, we now had multiple stems. So we essentially acted like stump sprouts. So it worsened the condition. Fire is not the solution to controlling the beech understory. We did reduce the density with a second fire, but still not enough to do the job. So I think you ought to use mechanical means, or during the summer, or a herbicide. Remember, the fires you're burning at a time when the carbohydrate reserves are still in the root systems, and that will tend to increase stump sprouting. When you burn a sucker, you're creating essentially a stump sprout. So look for something other than the fire to do that job.
It's an interesting question, but I suspect many of you know that American beech tends to grow in ecosystems that are fairly cooler and wetter on the whole, and so fire hasn't really been a piece of that system a whole lot, and where it shows up more in the Midwest. I've seen it in places where you have a fire that might be happened on one side of a river, and that stand tends to be to oak hickory after the fire, or pine. The side that hasn't been burned tends to be that beech maple, more mesic. So the soils and the hydrology are going to drive a lot of that, as well as the sort of the management implications of fire as a prescribed tool. Great questions. So, James asks, can you do a chemical brown and burn on an area, or do you have the same effect as a simple burn? I am definitely not qualified to answer that question because that's a specific management question.
Yeah, I don't know. Pat Bros down at the Forestry Sciences Lab at Warren, Pennsylvania, has done a lot of work with understory control in oak forest using fire. He would be a good source to ask that question.
Thank you. Mark asks, what is the evidence that a live beech supports suckers from dead beech trees via the connection of the root systems? So looking for evidence on that. Yes, so the issue there is that the original, if you will, the mature stem of the beech is killed from beech bark disease, and then the root suckers that are off of that root system will then grow kind of in that radius around the original larger stem. So the root systems are absolutely connected, and I'm not sure what you mean by looking for evidence, but this has been shown in many studies that that David Houston has done, as well as others. So I'm not sure if we can add anything to that, but it's absolutely what happens.
Yeah, the disease does not spread through the root system. It infects the trees through the openings created by the scale insect, and it's a beech bark disease. It's not a root disease. So if there are suckers around there that are photosynthesizing, it'll keep at least parts of the root system functioning.
One of the interesting things that we see with that is often, and perhaps some of you have seen this, you go into the woods and you see some large dead beech that might be years old, snags, but then around them, there are these smaller stems that are producing nuts, and they're quite narrow. They have a small diameter. And we think what's probably going on there is that because those root systems are connected, those suckers are coming off that original root system. So it's essentially mature enough to produce nuts, even though the tree doesn't really look big enough to do it or old enough to do it. So the maturity might be coming from, again, shared carbohydrate storage in the root system, or maybe there's some hormones that are moving back and forth that are allowing that tree to be reproductively mature. It's probably multiple things going on there, but it's kind of interesting when you come across a very small beech seedling, looks like a seedling, looks like a sapling, but it's producing nuts in a way that you might not expect it to. We have a couple of more minutes here. If anybody has any other questions, this is great. Thank you so much for all your comments and interest.
Stacy, you have done a great job drawing questions from an evening crowd. They're usually pretty tight-lipped, but this has been a very good conversation. I appreciate your efforts. I appreciate everybody's participation. So I think we will call this evening's webinar to a close. I want to thank Ralph and Stacy again. This was a really fabulous topic, and I was chatting in the chat session with Stacy. I mean, beech is like, if there was only one thing to talk about in webinars, beech would probably always generate an audience. So it's a really great story. There's a lot of complexity to understand, as you both know very well. So thanks everyone. Thanks especially Ralph and Stacy. Remember, next month there is no ForestConnect webinar. We're encouraging everyone to participate in the Northern Hardwoods Conference. So have a great evening. Enjoy the rest of the week. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Ralph and Stacy.
Thank you so much.